At 11:43 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, on a Tuesday morning in late April, the United States Navy implemented a maritime interdiction operation in the Strait of Hormuz that would cut Iranian oil export revenue to functionally zero within 72 hours. What happened next represents the most significant shift in Persian Gulf power dynamics since Operation Praying Mantis in 1988. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through this choke point flows approximately 21 million barrels of oil per day, representing roughly 21% of global petroleum consumption. For the Islamic Republic of Iran, this waterway is not merely strategically important. It is economically existential. Iran exports approximately 1,850,000 barrels of crude oil daily, generating revenue that represents 68% of total government budget receipts. The new American strategy did not close the strait. It did something far more surgical and far more devastating. It created conditions where Iranian oil becomes commercially untransportable while maintaining free passage for every other nation's energy supplies. The operation's elegance lies in its legal architecture and tactical execution. The United States did not impose a blockade, which would constitute an act of war under international maritime law. Instead, American naval forces established enhanced vessel inspection protocols under existing United Nations Security Council resolutions targeting Iranian weapons proliferation and sanctions evasion. Every tanker departing Iranian ports now faces mandatory inspection by U.S. Navy boarding teams. The inspections are thorough, time-consuming, and conducted with strict adherence to international law. A single inspection takes between 14 and 18 hours to complete. The Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers USS Spruance and USS Stockdale, operating in rotation with 3 additional vessels from Carrier Strike Group 3, can process approximately 6 tankers per day. Iran typically loads between 40 and 52 tankers weekly for export. The mathematics are brutal and unavoidable. This is not hypothetical disruption arriving weeks or months from now. Iranian oil revenues dropped 94% in the first 72 hours of operation. The remaining 6% represents previously contracted shipments that departed Iranian waters before the new protocols took effect. As of this morning, 0 new tankers have successfully loaded Iranian crude and cleared American inspection to reach international markets. 0. The implications of this development extend far beyond Middle Eastern regional security. Global oil markets, Chinese energy security calculations, Russian geopolitical maneuvering, and the survival calculus of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps all shift fundamentally when Iranian oil revenue ceases to flow. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now and hit that notification bell, because what happens in the next 14 days will determine whether this operation succeeds in forcing the most significant Iranian policy reversal in 4 decades or triggers escalation that could engulf the entire Persian Gulf in conflict. The economic mechanics of Iran's current situation create a countdown timeline that leaves the regime with extraordinarily limited options. Iran's crude oil storage capacity totals approximately 47 million barrels across above-ground facilities at Karg Island, onshore terminals at Bandar Abbas, and floating storage on converted tankers anchored in the Persian Gulf. With production running at 250,000 barrels per day and exports effectively halted, storage capacity fills at a rate of 250,000 barrels daily. Simple division reveals that Iran reaches maximum storage capacity in 21. 9 days from the moment exports stopped. Once storage is completely full, Iranian oil wells must be shut down, or production continues with crude being dumped into holding facilities already at capacity, creating catastrophic environmental damage and permanent reservoir damage that makes future production impossible. Shutting down oil production is not analogous to turning off a light switch. Oil reservoirs operate under specific pressure and temperature conditions that allow crude to flow from underground formations to the surface. When production stops, reservoir pressure drops. Depending on geological characteristics, restarting production after extended shutdown can require extensive and expensive remedial work, including drilling new wells, implementing enhanced recovery techniques, and accepting permanently reduced output from damaged formations. Iranian reservoir engineering capacity and financial resources make large-scale remediation unlikely. Wells shut down during this crisis may never produce at previous rates again. The Iranian regime understands these dynamics perfectly. The countdown to storage capacity exhaustion is not merely an economic deadline. It represents a threshold beyond which permanent, irreversible damage begins accumulating. The revenue loss timeline compounds the storage crisis. Iran's government operates on monthly budget cycles, requiring consistent cash flow to maintain subsidies, pay security forces, fund proxy organizations throughout the Middle East, and sustain the sprawling economic empire controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC controls an estimated 30 to 40% of Iran's domestic economy through construction companies, telecommunications networks, oil contracts, banking operations, ports, and airports. These enterprises require continuous capital infusion to maintain operations and political loyalty. Before this operation, Iranian oil exports generated approximately $150 million in daily revenue. That is $5 billion per month, $54 billion annually. The sudden cessation of this cash flow creates immediate pressure on every aspect of regime operations. Iranian foreign currency reserves, depleted through years of sanctions and economic mismanagement, provide limited buffer capacity. The Central Bank of Iran maintains approximately $86 billion in foreign exchange reserves, but the majority of these holdings are either frozen in foreign accounts due to sanctions, illiquid in forms like gold or hard assets, or committed to essential imports, including food, medicine, and industrial inputs. Liquid, accessible foreign currency reserves available for discretionary government spending total approximately $18 billion. At Iran's current burn rate of government expenditures, these reserves provide roughly 4 months of operating capacity before the regime faces the choice between defaulting on domestic obligations or implementing austerity measures that could trigger popular unrest. The United States Navy positioned forces for this operation with methodical precision over an 8-week period that Iranian intelligence apparently failed to recognize as preparation for coordinated action. Carrier Strike Group 3, centered on the aircraft carrier USS George Washington, deployed to the Persian Gulf on February 14th. The strike group includes the carrier, 4 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, 1 Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, and 1 Los Angeles-class nuclear attack submarine, operating below the surface. The strike group's air wing consists of approximately 70 aircraft, including FA-18 Super Hornets, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft, and MH-60R Seahawk helicopters configured for anti-surface and anti-submarine warfare. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyers conducting vessel inspections carry comprehensive sensor suites and weapon systems that make interference with boarding operations extraordinarily dangerous for any potential adversary. Each destroyer displaces 9,200 tons fully loaded, stretches 505 feet in length, and carries a crew of 329. The ships mount the AN Spy-1D phased array radar system, capable of tracking over 100 targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 200 nautical miles. For air defense, the vessels carry 90 to 96 vertical launch system cells loaded with a mix of SM-2 surface-to-air missiles, SM-3 ballistic missile interceptors, SM-6 long-range multi-mission missiles, and evolved Sea Sparrow short-range point defense missiles. For surface warfare, the ships carry Harpoon anti-ship missiles with a range of 67 nautical miles and a 5-inch Mark 45 naval gun capable of firing 20 rounds per minute to a range of 13 nautical miles. Below the waterline, Mark 32 triple torpedo tubes carry Mark 54 lightweight torpedoes for anti-submarine warfare. This weapons package makes clear that any Iranian attempt to interfere with boarding operations would face immediate and overwhelming response. Iranian naval forces consist primarily of small, fast attack boats armed with anti-ship missiles, naval mines, and a small number of diesel-electric submarines. These forces excel at asymmetric harassment tactics in confined waters, but cannot survive direct engagement with American guided missile destroyers equipped with comprehensive air defense, surface warfare, and anti-submarine capabilities. Iran knows this. The United States knows Iran knows this. The calculation of relative military power is not ambiguous. But here's where the strategy becomes truly extraordinary. The inspection protocol does not target Iranian vessels exclusively. Under the legal framework established through United Nations Security Council resolutions, the United States Navy inspects all vessels departing Iranian ports, regardless of flag state, ownership, or declared cargo. This means tankers owned by Chinese companies, flagged in Pacific Island nations, and operated by Greek crews all face the same mandatory inspection process. The universality of the inspections removes the ability to circumvent the operation through flag of convenience arrangements or shell company ownership structures that Iran has used for years to evade sanctions. A tanker loading crude at Karg Island must submit to American inspection before proceeding to international waters. There are no exceptions. There are no exemptions. There are no alternative routes. The Chinese government response to this operation reveals calculations that prioritize energy security over alliance commitments to Iran. China imports approximately 10 million barrels of oil per day, making it the world's largest crude oil consumer. Iranian crude historically provides roughly 900,000 barrels daily to Chinese refiners, representing 9% of total Chinese imports. This is significant but not irreplaceable. Saudi Arabia supplies approximately 1,650,000 barrels per day to China. Iraq provides 1,180,000 barrels daily. Russia exports 1,570,000 barrels per day to Chinese markets. The United Arab Emirates ships 570,000 barrels daily. Oman contributes 480,000 barrels daily. Alternative supply sources exist throughout the Persian Gulf that can replace Iranian volumes within weeks once Chinese buyers redirect purchase contracts. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement on the third day of operations, describing the American actions as unilateral and provocative, while simultaneously instructing Chinese state-owned oil companies to suspend new loading contracts at Iranian ports pending clarification of shipping conditions. That instruction, delivered through the State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission, effectively ends Chinese purchases of Iranian crude until the inspection regime is lifted or until Beijing decides the strategic value of supporting Iran outweighs the economic and political costs of confronting American naval power in the Persian Gulf. Current analysis suggests Beijing is extremely unlikely to make that calculation. China has no defense treaty with Iran, no vital strategic interest in Iranian regime survival, and abundant alternative oil suppliers eager to capture market share previously held by Iranian exports. The Russian response follows a similar pattern of performed solidarity combined with practical abandonment. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov condemned the American operation as a violation of freedom of navigation, a statement notable for its irony given Russian naval operations in the Black Sea. However, Russian state oil company Rosneft quietly increased crude oil exports to Asian markets by 340,000 barrels per day in the week following the operation's start, capturing revenue and market share that Iranian suppliers can no longer fill. Russia benefits economically from higher global oil prices caused by Iranian supply removal and from the opportunity to replace Iranian volumes in markets like China, India, and Turkey. Moscow's geopolitical posturing costs nothing, while Russian oil companies profit from Iran's crisis. The trap worked. Subscribe and turn on notifications right now because the internal Iranian decision-making process unfolding at this moment will determine not just the immediate outcome of this crisis, but the entire trajectory of Middle Eastern security dynamics for the next decade. What you are about to hear represents information that most mainstream coverage is completely missing. The Iranian regime is not a unified actor making coherent strategic decisions through clear chains of command. It is a fractured coalition of competing power centers with divergent institutional interests, personal rivalries stretching back 4 decades, and fundamentally incompatible visions of how to respond to the current crisis. Understanding this internal dynamic is essential to predicting what happens next. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, now 85 years old and in declining health, maintains theoretical final authority over all state decisions, but exercises that authority through managing competing factions rather than issuing direct commands that all institutions obey. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps operates with substantial autonomy and often pursues policies that directly contradict stated government positions. The regular Iranian military, known as the Artesh, maintains separate command structures and has limited coordination with IRGC forces. The civilian government, led by President Masoud Pezeshkian, holds legal authority over economic policy and diplomatic relations, but cannot control security decisions dominated by the IRGC. This fragmented structure creates opportunities for the United States to exploit divisions, but also creates risks of escalation from IRGC elements acting without coordination with other regime components. Ahmad Vahidi serves as Minister of Interior and brings to that position a background that includes command responsibility for the 1994 bombing of the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires that killed 85 people. Argentina maintains an Interpol red notice for Vahidi's arrest, a warrant that has followed him for 3 decades. Vahidi represents the hardline IRGC faction that built careers on militant resistance to the United States and will not accept diplomatic capitulation without exhausting military options first. In internal regime debates, Vahidi advocates for escalation, including mining the Strait of Hormuz, launching missile strikes on Saudi and Emirati oil infrastructure, and activating proxy forces throughout the region to create multiple simultaneous crisis points that divide American attention. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, by contrast, represents the diplomatic faction that recognizes Iran's fundamental military and economic disadvantage in direct confrontation with the United States. Araghchi participated in the nuclear negotiations that produced the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015 and maintains relationships with European diplomatic channels that could provide pathways to negotiated resolution. In internal debates, Araghchi argues that accepting temporary oil export interruption while negotiating American withdrawal of inspection forces represents a less catastrophic outcome than military escalation that Iran cannot win, and economic collapse that the regime cannot survive. Between these poles, President Pezeshkian attempts to navigate a course that satisfies hardline demands for resistance while avoiding decisions that trigger terminal economic collapse. Pezeshkian's political base consists of middle-class urban Iranians frustrated with decades of economic sanctions, international isolation, and declining living standards. This constituency wants relief from economic pressure more than ideological confrontation with the West. However, Pezeshkian's political survival depends on avoiding any appearance of capitulation to American pressure, which would invite accusations of weakness from IRGC hardliners who view compromise as betrayal. The IRGC's institutional interests diverge fundamentally from Iranian national interests, a divergence that shapes decision-making in ways outside observers often miss. Without external enemies and active conflict, the IRGC's economic empire becomes a political question rather than a strategic necessity. Why does a country not at war need a parallel military force controlling 40% of the economy? The IRGC requires ongoing conflict and external threat to justify its privileged position within Iranian society. Resolving tensions with the United States through diplomatic compromise threatens the IRGC's institutional rationale for existence. This creates perverse incentives where the organization nominally responsible for national defense has institutional reasons to perpetuate conflict rather than resolve it. The countdown to storage capacity exhaustion forces these competing factions toward a decision point none of them want to face. At current production and consumption rates, Iran reaches maximum storage capacity on May 19th, exactly 14 days from today. As that deadline approaches, 3 possible Iranian responses emerge as most likely scenarios. The first scenario involves immediate escalation designed to force American withdrawal through asymmetric attacks that raise the cost of maintaining inspection operations. This approach would likely include IRGC fast attack boats harassing American vessels, mining operations in the Strait of Hormuz, missile strikes on Saudi oil infrastructure to reduce global supply and spike oil prices, and activation of proxy forces in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon to create multiple simultaneous crisis points. The IRGC Navy maintains approximately 200 fast attack boats armed with anti-ship missiles and could launch coordinated swarm attacks designed to overwhelm American defensive systems through mass and unpredictability. Iranian naval mines could be deployed covertly by small boats or submarines, creating navigation hazards that reduce tanker traffic and increase insurance costs throughout the Persian Gulf. Ballistic missiles launched from Iranian territory could strike Saudi oil facilities at Ras Tanura and Abqaiq, facilities that process approximately 7 million barrels of Saudi crude daily. Combined, these actions could remove 8 to 10 million barrels per day from global oil supply, potentially driving prices above $140 per barrel and creating economic pressure for Washington to negotiate. The risk calculation for this scenario centers on American military response. The United States demonstrated in 1988 during Operation Praying Mantis that Iranian attacks on Gulf shipping trigger overwhelming conventional military retaliation that destroys Iranian naval and offshore oil infrastructure within hours. In that operation, American forces sank 2 Iranian warships, destroyed 2 offshore oil platforms, and damaged several Iranian naval vessels while sustaining minimal casualties. The operation lasted approximately 8 hours and established the precedent that Iranian escalation in the Persian Gulf produces Iranian loss, far exceeding any damage inflicted on American interests. Current American military capability in the region exceeds 1988 levels by orders of magnitude. The IRGC understands that escalation produces terminal defeat. The second scenario involves partial capitulation disguised as negotiated compromise. Iran could propose reopening nuclear negotiations, offering concessions on uranium enrichment and centrifuge numbers in exchange for American withdrawal of inspection forces and relief from certain economic sanctions. This approach allows the regime to frame the outcome as mutual compromise rather than surrender to American pressure. Supreme Leader Khamenei could authorize foreign ministry negotiations while maintaining domestic messaging that Iran forced the United States to the negotiating table through steadfast resistance. The nuclear program provides convenient bargaining chips because Iran can later rebuild enrichment capacity covertly while immediately restoring oil export revenue. The challenge with this scenario is verification and enforcement. The United States would require intrusive inspection protocols to verify Iranian nuclear compliance, creating the same credibility problems that doomed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action when Iran was discovered violating enrichment limits. American demands would likely include permanent caps on enrichment levels, destruction of advanced centrifuges, removal of enriched uranium stockpiles, international access to all declared and suspected nuclear sites, and binding commitments preventing future ballistic missile development. Iranian hardliners view these demands as unacceptable surrender of sovereign rights and the foundation of future deterrent capability. Whether Khamenei can sell this compromise to IRGC factions remains uncertain. The third scenario represents complete regime intransigence, combined with a bet on enduring economic pain longer than the United States maintains inspection operations. Iranian leadership could calculate that American domestic political pressures, particularly gasoline price increases from reduced global oil supply, will force Washington to lift inspections before Iranian storage capacity forces well shutdowns. This approach requires Iran to survive economically for an undefined period, while oil exports remain blocked and government revenues collapse. The regime would likely implement extreme austerity, eliminate subsidies on fuel and basic goods, impose strict currency controls, and increase repression to prevent protests over declining living conditions. The viability of this scenario depends on the Iranian population's willingness to endure substantial economic hardship without triggering unrest that threatens regime stability. Iran experienced nationwide protests in November 2019 following fuel price increases, demonstrations that killed an estimated 1,500 people when security forces opened fire on protesters. The economic shock from complete oil revenue loss would dwarf the subsidy cuts that triggered those protests. Whether the regime's security apparatus can prevent or suppress similar unrest under far worse economic conditions remains an open question that may be answered within weeks. Each scenario carries risks the Iranian regime cannot fully control. Escalation triggers American military response that destroys Iranian naval capability and offshore oil infrastructure, worsening the economic crisis. Negotiated capitulation fractures the regime internally as hardliners accuse the leadership of surrender. Sustained intransigence leads to economic collapse, popular unrest, and potential regime change. These are not good options. They are the only options. The historical parallel that shapes American strategic thinking on this operation is not primarily the 1988 Operation Praying Mantis, though that precedent matters. The more relevant comparison is the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, particularly the quarantine of Cuba that prevented delivery of Soviet nuclear missiles while maintaining plausible deniability about acts of war. President John F. Kennedy implemented a naval blockade of Cuba that the administration carefully termed a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of blockade as an act of war. Soviet ships approaching Cuba faced mandatory inspection and would be turned back if carrying prohibited weapons. The operation succeeded in preventing missile delivery without triggering Soviet military response, establishing the precedent that carefully calibrated naval operations can achieve strategic objectives without escalating to direct military conflict. The Hormuz inspection regime employs similar legal architecture. This is not a blockade preventing all traffic. It is an inspection protocol enforcing United Nations Security Council resolutions against weapons proliferation and sanctions evasion. The distinction matters legally and diplomatically, providing American officials with arguments that the operation represents lawful maritime security enforcement rather than aggressive military action. Whether this distinction prevents Iranian escalation depends on calculations being made in Tehran at this moment by men whose personal histories, institutional loyalties, and risk assessments remain opaque to outside observers.